Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. An answer to what? Well, you know all of that. Today we have taken up daily edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 26th of March 2022. The articles which we shall take up today have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion.
First news which we have taken: India UK end round 2 talks on FTA or free trade agreements. So India and UK have concluded their second round of negotiations towards a bilateral free trade agreement in London last Thursday, with a draft treaty text discussed across most chapters that will make up the pact. This has been released by Commerce Ministry. Now, following the discussion in 64 separate sessions covering 26 policy areas, the two sides have decided to carry forward the negotiations next month. So, the free trade agreement between India and UK has not been finalized yet. But nonetheless, understanding of free trade agreement is extremely important to understand India's external relations as well as India's economy. Because if you look into GS paper 2, bilateral groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interests is a part of your syllabus. And so it becomes important for us to understand free trade agreements. Now, free trade agreements have to be understood from the perspective of what they are and how many kinds of levels exist when two countries come together to finalize an agreement for trading. You must have heard various names like preferential trade agreement, free trade agreement, regional trade agreement, CECA, CEPA, BTIA. So what are the implications and meanings of these different terms? How are they different from each other? And finally, what are the advantages of signing free trade agreements between two nations? Why do most of the nations formulate some kind of FTAs with a lot of countries? And why do we need it despite WTO existing? So all these things we are going to discuss in this discussion. Alright, so starting the discussion with the very basics about which most of the aspirants are confused as to what are free trade agreements. And so let us start by first defining what free trade agreement is. So put simply, free trade agreement is an agreement between two or more nations, establishing fair set of rules for both trade and commerce. And we will see how this trade and commerce can deal with goods, services, or even with the investments. Now, these agreements are not like normal agreements between two countries. These agreements should be legally binding commitments as far as the 2 or 3 or whatever be the number of the parties entering into the agreement is concerned. It should be legally binding on all of them. Only then it would enable proper and fair trade and commerce between two or more countries. Now, once these countries enter into such an agreement, they promise each other to gradually and slowly provide preferential treatment to the goods and services from each other. And so one of the examples would be to reduce or eliminate various kinds of trade barriers. For example, the import duty or import quota or the number of items which can be imported in a country from another country. And so what happens when these two countries or two or more countries entered into a free trade agreement, they slowly and gradually keep on reducing these kinds of trade barriers. And generally there is a sequence which is followed in most cases. You start by first liberalizing the trade in goods, then you move on to the services and finally into the investments. And so when you have a level of commitment and the trust between 2 or 3 or more countries where you can talk about setting up of rules for investment, which means that you have already achieved the highest level of commitment. And so that is why generally the countries start by first liberalizing the trade of goods. So at the very basic level, even in the goods, the countries start by first either reducing or removing altogether import duties on a lot of products. And it is not important that these agreements should cover each and every goods exchange between the countries. They can start by liberalizing only one product, or they can start by 100 products, or even they can go to include all the products, but generally it is not extended to all the products. So they can start by first reducing the import duties on selected few items. So reduction of import duty is all about reduction of tariff barrier. But then you have a lot of non-tariff barriers which are hindering the trade between the two nations. And so then countries focus on reduction of non-tariff barriers. And then finally, when they have done significantly on these two fronts, they move on to ease customs procedure. which is all about reducing the amount of time it takes to transact a good from one nation to another. For example, the two countries design or modify their port clearances procedure in such a way that when a country A, having signed an agreement with country B, sends their goods to the country B, B understands that they have FTA and they don't need any kind of clearance because we know what kind of procedure is being followed in A while export, and so at import there is no need for higher scrutiny, and so it will reduce the amount of time which will take for a product exported from A to reach into the domestic market of country B. So now you can clearly understand that how these three kinds of measures would go a long way in rapidly increasing the exchange of goods between two countries which sign an FTA. Once they have done this for goods, then they move on to the services where they make sure that there is an enhanced level of access which is being provided. And one of the best examples would be the recognition of the degree of India into B, so that the Indian people having a normal BTech from Indian universities and colleges can go to US and serve as software engineers there without reappearing for examination. And so that is the kind of difference you can see, that a lot of countries do not recognize a lot of services being provided in India, and that is why when they go to US they have to requalify their domestic examinations, whereas in some of the cases it is not true. And so this is where the services sector or the enhancement of access to services sector comes into play. After the liberalization of the service regime, they finally move on to the investment regimes where they design the rules so that they are able to protect investment from country A into country B and vice versa. These rules are designed so that no national government can make rules which adversely impact one another's investment into each other. Now moving on to the question which often baffles the aspirants, which is what are the differences between all these six terms? What is this PTA, FTA, RTA, SEPA, CISA and BTIA? And so you can clearly see that I have written three names above and three names below because they can be clearly demarcated from each other in two groups. The first group involves more traditional forms of agreements, which are preferential trade agreement, free trade agreement and regional trade agreements. All these three mostly are limited to the exchange of goods. They are the traditional form of agreements in which two or more nations have been associating each other. Whereas the three terms written below are more comprehensive in their approach, and hence the name comprehensive, because they are integrated packages not just covering goods but also services, intellectual property rights protection, also investment protection. So when you have two countries negotiating with each other in so many domains of trade and commerce, that is called a CECA, CEPA or BTIA, and which is what India and European Union are doing right now. So there is no clear-cut official designation from the government of India as to how these will vary, but when a name includes CECA or BTIA, you must understand that these two countries are negotiating not just for goods but also for access to each other's services, IPR protection and investment protection. Whereas when two countries think of negotiating whatever has been written in the first row, they're just talking, or their agreement is just limited to the access and exchange of goods. Now the basic question: two countries can trade normally, they can trade under the WTO regime, they can trade with each other even without WTO regime. So what advantages do these FTAs or these BTIAs or CECAs provide over the existing regime that the countries try to enter into such an agreement? There has to be some very solid reason for the nations to do an agreement. Now, first and foremost advantage of two countries signing a free trade agreement is that the members of an agreement gain benefit over non-members, and we are going to understand this with a very simple illustration. Let's say that this is a country A which has the domestic market, and then you have another country B, and A and B sign a free trade agreement among them, under which the A and B both decide to do away on exchange of or the trade of cars. So any car which is made in B and exported to A will attract 0% duty, and similar will be the case when a car is manufactured in A and goes to B, 0% duty. And so these are the only two countries under the FTA. And let's say that there is another country C, excellent manufacturer of cars, the best in the world, but has not entered into any such free trade agreement either with A or with B. And so, even though it produces the best and most efficient cars, it is exposed to the 20% import duty when it exports its cars to either B or A. So what this free trade agreement between A and B has done, that it has protected the domestic manufacturing of both A and B from much more superior and efficient industry of C through a simple reduction of tariffs. So this was the example which was just limited to the goods. What about services? And similarly, let's say that if A and B decide that they are going to recognize the professionals involved in accountancy, for example, the chartered accountants, and people involved in legal professional, for example, lawyers, of each other into each other's territory. And so, for example, a person graduating in legal stream, a lawyer in B, can go to A and practice in A's court. And similar is the case with A and B. And if they do that, you can understand that the professionals of A and B have much more advantage in each other's territories as compared to a person who could be the best person in the world, who could be the most intelligent, knowledgeable and skillful person in the world in that field, but still would not be allowed to practice as a lawyer in either A and B. And so you can see clearly that signing of free trade agreement provides huge advantage and benefits to the members over the non-members. So that is point one. Then comes the ease of negotiations. Now, what does this mean? Of course, there has to be ease of negotiations. Only then an agreement can come forward. But here we are talking with respect to the multinational or intergovernmental organizations, especially WTO. We know that there are two peculiar things or the traits with WTO which make it exceedingly difficult for the countries to arrive at a decision. First is the vast membership of WTO. And then the requirement that each and every country would have to be on board, that is, the decisions will be made on consensus. Even if one country or two countries do not agree out of 150, the decisions would not be made. And so that is the problem with the larger organizations. And so it provides a very, very advantageous situations for 3, 4, 5 countries in a region, that they can negotiate their own rules and regulations and they can arrive at a consensus much sooner as compared to a platform as wide and large as WTO. Then third biggest advantage of free trade agreement is that it provides the quickest way to increase the market size. The national governments of the countries design a lot of policies, financial policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies to increase the size of their market. But the free trade agreements are the easiest way to do that. For example, a country A in isolation would have an economy of this size. Country B in isolation would have an economy of this size. But let's assume that if they sign a free trade agreement dealing with the exchange of the goods, which means that most of the goods, even if not most, but some of the goods can be exchanged freely between these two nations, would mean that as far as those chosen and selected goods are concerned, now the market size is this much, which is massive boost to both these countries' economy. And so that is why it is the quickest way to increase the market size. Then the next biggest advantage of free trade agreements are that they lock in reforms. And they lock in reforms in such a way that reversal on a particular economic policy or a set of policies become very, very difficult for national governments. And to make this point clear, you'll have to understand that political parties have an agenda because of which they try to capture the power. And a part of agenda also includes economic policy. So most national parties have some or the other idea about how they are going to carry on with the economics of the country. But the problem is that in a democratic setup, these political parties in power keep on changing. And so when a particular party initiates a kind of reform, which is appreciated not just globally but also domestically, which is thought of as beneficial to overall economy, could well be reversed by the next government in power. But if a country signs a free trade agreement, it would become very, very difficult for the oncoming governments to remove or reverse it, simply because it is a legally binding agreement. When you sign an agreement between A and B, when two countries A and B sign an agreement, they promise each other for rest of the life or some 50 years, 30 years, 40 years that they are going to follow on what they have promised. If they have agreed that they are going to remove or reduce the import duty, they will do that, and they cannot be unilaterally taken away, not without any impunity. And so that is why it locks in reforms for a longer time. Then of course it leads to enhancement of trade between two countries, which is the starting point, which later on intensifies into increased diplomatic relations. And finally, signing more and more such agreements with the neighboring and other countries signals the openness or at least the intention of an economy to open up to the investors, which then opens the floodgate for foreign direct investment, because then only high net worth individuals, investors, they are confident enough that now this country is pursuing an agenda or is committing itself to follow rule based trading. And now if we invest in this particular country, our investment will not only safe, but it is also likely to grow. So the next news which we have taken up appears on page number 1 and its extension appears on page number 8. Peace in border areas key to normal ties, India tells China. So the Chinese foreign minister visited India yesterday. And India has directly and very straightforwardly communicated to China that there cannot be any normality in India-China ties unless the troops amassed at the line of actual control or LAC are withdrawn. And this is in continuation with the problems which India is facing due to the differing interpretation of LAC between India and China. Now, if you look at the syllabus of GS paper 3, under internal security, there is a line in the syllabus which says security challenges and their management in border areas. Now, this is quite an analytical topic, but when students start to prepare, no one is there to tell them what are the different kinds of border which India has. So, for example, India has international border, India has line of actual control, then India has line of control or LOC, and then India has actual ground position line or AGPL. Now it becomes very difficult sometimes to understand news articles with these kinds of terms scattered all around. But it is extremely important to understand the differences between them and how did they come to be like that. So in this discussion, we are going to understand the basics of Indian borders. And so let us start by understanding the simplest of these, which is international border. And so, as the name itself suggests, it is something, it is a line or it is an area which has been accepted by both the countries to be a border. The country A having absolute sovereignty towards this side, B having this side, and this will be international border. And so, there is no ambiguity or there is no doubt as to which place or which location on the map belongs to which country. There is absolutely no confusion over the territorial control as far as these two countries are concerned. Only then it is characterized as an international border. And so, the best example of an international border in case of India would be Radcliffe Line. Through our knowledge of history, we know that Radcliffe Line actually divided the British India into India and Pakistan, of course later on from which was derived Bangladesh. And so let us now move on to the map and do some practical work and try to locate the Radcliffe Line on India's map. And so when we talk about India-Pakistan border, the Radcliffe Line starts somewhere over here, it goes here, and then it ends. Then another portion of Radcliffe Line divided India and Pakistan, which later on became Bangladesh. And so these two are the original remnants of Radcliffe Line, which mark the international border of India with that of Pakistan and that of Bangladesh. If we have to be more precise, then international border between India and Pakistan starts in Gujarat and ends at Akhnur sector in Jammu and Kashmir. And since this is a mutually accepted border by both the countries, it has normal mechanisms to solve day-to-day issues. For example, some person might be crossing the international border, and so the repatriation of that person back to the original country. Apart from that, there are certain checkposts. There are transport lines through which the railways and the buses can cross through. All this available on the international border, normally just like any other international border, and similar is the case with international border with Bangladesh. And so that's why this section with Pakistan never observes any kind of firing, because firing is a result of a dispute between two nations. And so generally this is completely peaceful border, the border with Punjab, the border with Rajasthan, the border with Gujarat. And so that is why these borders are generally not guarded by Indian Army, but rather they are guarded by border security forces, both along the India-Bangladesh as well as India-Pakistan border. And since they allow normal transport of people, and so that is why they also have normal checkposts. And as I've said, since they are normal borders, there are setups for immigration as well as custom controls, because the exchange of not just people but also goods take place from time to time. Of course, since last 2 to 3 years, most of the activities even along the international border between India and Pakistan have been suspended, but nonetheless, they are the accepted borders between India and Pakistan. Now, whenever we talk about the border between India and Pakistan, there are two more components to it. One is line of control and another one is actual ground position line. And to be able to understand what these means, I would like you to go back some time in history at the time of partition, 1947, and you might recall that India and Pakistan entered into quite a bitter war immediately after independence, right? So when India and Pakistan entered into a bitter war just after independence, and as soon as the war stopped mainly because of the intervention from international community, a ceasefire agreement was signed between the two nations. Along with the ceasefire line was a truce. And so this ceasefire line, which basically means that the person will stay wherever they are, but they are not going to fight further. And so that is what ceasefire line is, which was accepted as line of control. Because that is line which might not be acceptable to both the nations, but that is the line which actually on ground the two nations are controlling. So just after the independence, a lot of territory of Jammu and Kashmir, or the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, was captured by Pakistan. Although Indian army was quite successful in pushing back these Pakistani quite a bit, but before they could be completely pushed into the Pakistani territory, a ceasefire was called, and so Indian army had to stop pushing them back. And so if we zoom it in, we'll see the line of actual control looks something like this. So you have international border, and then as soon as international border ends, you have the line of actual control starting right from the Akhnur. And so this region of Jammu and Kashmir beyond the line of actual control is known as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Now there are two things which are important, which you should note very, very distinctly over here. First and foremost is the term itself. Line of control is a very particular and specific term denoting only this particular line starting from Akhnur and going up to Siachen Glacier. And this particular term cannot be used for any other particular section of border of India with its neighboring country. Although it is a ceasefire line, but it has been delineated on map, which means that both the armies have a map in which they have agreed that these are the points which when connected give result to the line of actual control. Not just that, these agreements have been signed by both the armies. Now there is a difference between an agreement on a border signed between the armies or among the armies and from among the nation states. And this is what a basic difference between international border and non-international border is. And so you can say that line of actual control is kind of a practical arrangement on ground among the militaries of the two countries. But having been delineated on map and having been agreed by both the armies does not implies that it is agreeable condition or situation as far as both countries are concerned. It is still disputed. We still show Pakistan occupied Kashmir in the map of India, which basically means that we do not as of now agree to this particular line as international border, and so it is not a permanent border according to both the countries, but they have agreed to maintain status quo for at least some time to come. Of course, it has lasted for 60 years. Where this line is located could also change, or it could also transform itself into an international border. You never know. So after having understood international border and line of control, it's time for us to understand this last section of India-Pakistan border, which is actual ground position line, which is basically the line which divides India and Pakistan as far as the control over Siachen Glacier is concerned. It extends from northernmost point of LOC, which is the point NJ9842, and extends up to Indra Kol. Now, if you try to understand it on map, there is a point on ends, beyond which this whole region which I am shading in green color was simply not delineated because it is so inhospitable that no one thought anyone could even claim the control over there or could even go there because it is Siachen Glacier. And somewhere around here is Indra Kol. And a straight line connecting these 2 points is actual ground position line. On western side sits Pakistan, and on eastern side we have complete Siachen Glacier to our control. So when we talk about India's border with Pakistan, it consists of international border, with blue color, line of control with black color, and finally the blue color actual ground position line. And so we are left with only one kind of border, and that is line of actual control, which is used to refer to the disputed border which we share with China. And so, when we have discussed line of control which has been delineated on map and have been signed by both the armies, but in case of line of actual control, it has never been put on map. And if you are going through newspapers every day, you know that is the actual problem. Chinese lie claim to a territory which India does not agree to. India sends troops to a region which China says belongs to them, and that is happening only because this particular line or a boundary has never been put on map. There is no agreement between these two countries as to where the actual control should lie as far as both these nations are concerned. And so this particular line of actual control remains ambiguous even as of now. If we talk about its segregation, it is divided into three sectors: eastern, middle and western. The eastern sector, which spans Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, the middle sector in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, and the western sector, of course, in Ladakh. However, the line of actual control in Ladakh region does not conforms with the political map of our country which you are habitual of seeing. It runs something like this, with Aksai Chin controlled by China. Although it has never been put on map, but there is some kind of agreement to actually decide some of the points, and that was done in 1993 through agreement to maintain peace and tranquility. Through this agreement, India and China decided to maintain status quo on their border pending any eventual boundary settlement. So boundary settlement has not taken place, but until then the status quo will be maintained. Wherever the person is sitting will keep on sitting. But that does not prevent one country from imposing their own perception of line of actual control on the other country. And that is the basic reason why we are having so many scuffles between India and China. So I hope that this discussion would have cleared some of your doubts related to different kinds of borders which India shares with its neighbors. Let us now move on to the next news. Forging a social contract for data appears on page number 6, which talks about the draft data accessibility and use policy, which was released in the month of February 2020, which is last month, by Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, or METI. And in this particular article, the two authors talk about the issues or the lacuna in the given draft policy. Now this becomes extremely relevant because India is accelerating towards an online population, with the number of active internet users in India expected to increase by 45% in the next few years and touch 900 million by 2025. India is likely to have around 330 million 5G subscribers by 2026, and the monthly data consumption per smartphone is expected to grow over threefold to 40 gigabytes per smartphone. At the same time, we have seen how citizens are increasingly relying on digital services for citizen state services. With increasing digitalization and engagement, the volume of data is also increasing exponentially. India's ambitions of becoming a $5 trillion digital economy depends on its ability to harness the value of this data. Because the data could be very important for corporates, but more than that, it is important for improving the government services and for governance. Because the more the data you have, you improve your public service delivery. Because increased sharing of data across public and private sectors optimizes digital welfare delivery and increases administrative efficiency, enabling citizen-centric services. It improves the policy making and program evaluation at the same time, because unlocking data strengthens the evidence base for policy development and public administration, bringing targeted social benefits to citizens. It provides a lot of economic opportunities because improved availability of reliable, high-quality data catalyzes digital innovation for the public good, creating new economic opportunities. At the same time, it also enables social transformation because high-quality public data helps in innovation in sectors which are critical for social transformation like health, education, geospatial mapping. However, public data, which is non-personal, which is devoid of all the personal information, is not being used optimally by the government. And there are very valid reasons for that. Because right now, what we do is that we practice siloed data platforms. Silo means to work independently. Multiple line ministries, departments, agencies, and state governments maintain their own data portals. So for example, water department is going to have their own data set, which would be very different from the data of road department. There are several instances where these data portal dashboards are not integrated with open government data platform. Then at the same time, there is an absence of data anonymization and privacy preservation tools. Because if you want to use data you have to strip off all the private details of the people. Given that citizen data sets generated during service delivery contain personal identifier, for example, names, mobile numbers, their addresses, and so it is extremely important that we first anonymize the data and then put it on the public display. And so absence of data anonymization tools poses the risk of privacy violation. As we have understood, anonymization is a data processing technique that removes or modifies personal identifiable information, which results in anonymized data that cannot be associated with one individual. Then at the same time, there is a lack of framework for identification of high value data sets or HVDs. There are no standard classification criteria to assist chief data officers in identifying such data sets. As a result, many line ministries departments have not been able to consistently identify and maintain high value data sets. And then there is limited citizen engagement and data stewardship. Current open government data platform lack adequate mechanisms for community engagement and data stewardship. There is no mechanism for citizens to flag data sets due to privacy, security concerns, or potential misuse of data. And unless and until these 5-6 challenges are met, we cannot go ahead and enable higher use of non-personal data in government policy making. And that is why government has come up with draft India Data Accessibility and Use Policy 2022 with a lot of objectives. And you can read these objectives if you wish, but more or less it is about maximizing access to use of quality non-personal data available with public sector, improving policy making, evaluation and monitoring, etc., etc. And in that, there are few highlighting points which the government has come up with. When it comes to applicability, this policy will be applicable to all non-personal data and information created, generated, collected, archived by the Government of India directly or through authorized agencies by various ministries, departments, organizations, agencies, and even autonomous bodies. Government is also thinking of creating institutional framework. For example, India Data Office shall be set up by METI with an objective to streamline and consolidate data access and sharing of non-personal data repositories across the government and other stakeholders. Every ministry or department shall have data management units headed by chief data officers, which will work closely with data office for ensuring implementation of the data accessibility and use policy. India Data Council shall be constituted with an objective of understanding tasks that require deliberations across ministries, departments, and state governments. At the same time, every government, ministry, department, or organization shall identify non-personal data sets available with it and classify them as open, restricted, and non-shareable. When it comes to data anonymization and privacy preservation, these tools will be provided to all ministries and concerned departments to assist data officers in managing data sharing requests. At the same time, policy envisages capacity building and skill building measures as well. So from the perspective of prelims examination, it becomes very important. Also, from the perspective of mains examination, the use of non-personal data and its importance in service delivery is extremely important, as well as the challenges which are being faced right now. Let us now move on to the next news. So the GSLV F10/EOS-03 mission, which lifted off from Sriharikota on August 12 last year, failed due to a deviation in the performance of the cryogenic upper stage or CUS of the launch vehicle. A national level failure analysis committee has found. Now this was not such a great news because it put brakes on a series of 16 consecutive successful launches by ISRO since 2017. Missions like Gaganyaan and Chandrayaan-3 will be launched on GSLV Mk3, a more advanced version of GSLV rocket that is designed to carry much heavier payloads into space. So the failure of this mission is of course a cause of worry. It is big cause of worry for the NICER mission, a first of its kind collaboration between NASA and ISRO for a joint Earth observation satellite. Now in this regard, we are going to do two things. We are going to understand Earth observation satellites, and then we are going to understand GSLV or Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle. So Earth Observation Satellite, as the name suggests, is a satellite which does the job of observing the Earth. So what does Earth observation means? So Earth observation is the gathering of information about Earth's physical, chemical and biological systems. They collect information of any object on Earth through the measurement of radiation of the sun that is reflected and scattered by the objects on the surface of the Earth. They are mostly polar, sun-synchronous satellites in low Earth orbit at about 800 km from the surface of the Earth. Meteorological satellites can be launched in geostationary orbit for remote sensing. Now, India has one of the largest constellations of remote sensing satellites in operation. For example, currently 18 operational satellites are in sun-synchronous orbit, which are named ResourceSat 1, 2, 2A, Cartosat 1, 2, 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, 2E, 2EF, ReSat, OceanSat, Mega, Tropics, Saral, ScatSat, and EOS-01. And India has 4 satellites in geostationary orbit, which is the orbit which is farthest from the surface of the Earth, which are INSAT 3D, Kalpana, INSAT 3A, and INSAT 3DR. So except for INSAT, all other satellites are placed in sun-synchronous orbit. Whereas all the satellites which have INSAT in them, they are in geostationary orbit. Let us know in the comment section what are the typical altitude of these two kinds of satellites, mainly polar satellites and geostationary orbit satellites. Moving on to EOS-03 mission. EOS-3 was capable of imaging the entire country 4 to 5 times a day. It was lifted by GSLV rocket, having a new payload carrier designed to significantly reduce aerodynamic drag and thus carry larger payloads. The rocket was supposed to take the satellite to the geostationary transfer orbit, from where the satellite's onboard propulsion system will guide it to geostationary orbit, which is around 36,000 km from the surface of the Earth. Whereas geostationary transfer orbit is a circular orbit positioned approximately 35,900 km above the Earth's equator and having a period of the same duration and same direction as the rotation of the Earth. EOS-03 was a part of the new generation of Earth observation satellites meant to provide almost real-time images of large parts of the country. The images could be used for monitoring natural disasters like floods, cyclones, water bodies, crops, vegetation, and forest cover. Moving on to GSLV, or Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle. GSLV is a space launch vehicle designed by ISRO to launch satellites and other space objects into geosynchronous transfer orbits. They are launched into orbit in the same direction the Earth is spinning and can have any inclination. GSLV has the capability to put a heavier payload in orbit than PSLV, and it is a 3-stage launcher with strap-on motors. Next news which we have taken appears on page number 8. Online voting for NRIs under consideration, says Kiran Rijiju. So the government of India is exploring the possibility of allowing online voting for non-resident Indians, as well as considering linking Aadhaar with electoral rolls to check fraudulent voting. Earlier, the government was also contemplating to extend the facility of postal ballots to eligible overseas and non-resident Indians. However, so far, such facilities have not been extended. So from the perspective of prelims examination, it is important for us to understand the voting for Indian citizens staying abroad prior to 2010 and post 2010. So prior to 2010, an Indian citizen who was an eligible voter and was residing abroad for more than 6 months owing to employment, education or otherwise was not allowed to vote. This was because NRI's name was deleted from the electoral rolls if he or she stayed outside the country for more than 6 months at a stretch. But the Representation of the People's Act 2010 allowed NRIs who had stayed abroad beyond 6 months to vote, but only in person at polling station where they have been enrolled as an overseas elector. Overseas Indian citizens, like other Indian citizens, are therefore allowed to vote but have to be physically present. In the case of overseas voters, their address mentioned in the passport is taken as the place of ordinary residence and chosen as the constituency for the overseas voter enrollment. Now, the pertinent section of the Representation of the People's Act 1950 is Section 20A, which is about special provision for citizens of India residing outside India. And so, if online voting is allowed by the government, then Section 20A of the Representation of the People Act 1950 needs to be amended to allow online voting by NRIs even from outside India. So the reason why we discussed or took this news today is to make you understand that Representation of the People's Act is a statutory provision. Voting is a statutory provision, and so if any change has to be brought in the way people are made to vote, Representation of the People Act will require further amendments. The next news which we have taken up appears on page number 9. INS-Valsura awarded President's Color. INS-Valsura, which is a premier training establishment of the Indian Navy. It is entrusted with the responsibility of imparting training to officers and sailors of the Indian Navy, Coast Guard, and friendly foreign countries in electrical, electronics, weapon systems, and information technology. Since it has been awarded as a President Colors, it is bestowed on any military unit in recognition of the exceptional service rendered to the nation both during the time of peace as well as in war. The Indian Navy was the first Indian armed force to be awarded with the President Color by President Rajendra Prasad on 27th May 1951. Welcome to the question of the day for yesterday. Yesterday the question was about the SWIFT network and the right answer was neither one nor two, which was option D. Question of the day for today is consider the following statements. Statement 1. An Indian citizen who is an eligible voter and is residing abroad for more than 6 months owing to employment, education or otherwise is not allowed to vote in his constituency. Statement 2 is provisions for online voting for NRIs have been provided in the Representation of the People's Act 1951 through an amendment. Which one of the statements given above are incorrect? A. 1 only, B. 2 only, C. both 1 and 2, and D. neither 1 nor 2.